He ruled Romania like a king. His face was everywhere. People clapped when he spoke, not because they loved him, but because they were terrified. For over 2 decades, Nicolae Ceaușescu silenced anyone who dared to speak out. But in December 1989, everything collapsed. The man who once held a nation in fear was hunted, captured, and shot by his own soldiers in a cold military yard without mercy. Nicolae Ceaușescu was born on January 26, 1918, in Scornacești, a small village in southern Romania. His family was poor, his father was a peasant, and Nicolae was one of 10 children. As a teenager, he left the village to work as a shoemaker's apprentice in Bucharest. That's where he got involved with the illegal Romanian Communist Party, which was banned under King Carol II's regime. At just 17 years old, he was arrested for anti-government activities. Over the next 2 decades, he was arrested multiple times, spending years in prison between 1933 and 1944. These years in prison, especially at Toftana and Caransebeș, helped shape his hardline beliefs. He met older communist leaders there, including Gheorghe Gheorghu Dej, who later became Romania's first communist leader after the war. After the Soviet army entered Romania in 1944, communism quickly took over the country. Gheorghu Dej rose to power, and Ceaușescu remained loyal to him. In 1947, the Romanian monarchy was abolished, and the country became a People's Republic. Ceaușescu climbed the ranks of the Communist Party, serving as deputy defense minister and holding key posts in the Politburo. After Gheorghu Dej's death in March 1965, Ceaușescu was chosen as his successor. He became general secretary of the Romanian Communist Party that same month and head of state in 1967. By 1968, he held full political control. In his early years, Ceaușescu distanced himself from Moscow. When the Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia in August 1968 to crush the Prague Spring, Ceaușescu condemned the invasion publicly. This made him popular in the West. He was invited to meet with U.S. President Richard Nixon in 1969 and even signed trade agreements with Western countries. France's president, Charles de Gaulle, praised his independent path. But while he charmed the world abroad, at home he was tightening his grip. One of his strongest tools was the Securitate, Romania's secret police, which became one of the most feared agencies in Europe. Created in 1948, the Securitate grew massively under Ceaușescu's rule. By the 1980s, they had around 11,000 full-time officers and over 500,000 informants planted in every school, factory, and village. They monitored letters, tapped phones, placed hidden microphones inside homes, and regularly arrested or interrogated people who criticized the regime. People were terrified to speak openly, even in their own homes. Ceaușescu's wife, Elena, became a powerful figure in her own right. Though she had only a basic education, she was given top scientific titles and named Deputy Prime Minister in 1980. She controlled key ministries and headed the Romanian Academy of Sciences despite lacking qualifications. Together, they built a system where loyalty mattered more than skill. Entire schools were forced to memorize poems praising the beloved leaders, and children grew up thinking Ceaușescu was a hero. This wasn't just a dictatorship. It was a full-blown cult. His portraits hung in every classroom, office, and train station. His speeches were mandatory viewing. Entire towns were renamed or reshaped under his vision. The regime removed churches, historic buildings, and traditional villages to create his idea of a modern socialist society. But while the country looked organized on the surface, cracks were forming beneath. During the 1970s, Ceaușescu had taken massive loans from Western banks, over $10 million, hoping to industrialize Romania. He built huge factories, steel plants, and chemical complexes. But many of these projects were poorly managed and unprofitable. The economy didn't grow fast enough to repay the debts. By 1981, the country was nearly bankrupt. Ceaușescu's response was to launch a national plan to repay every cent. He called it a heroic effort. But for regular Romanians, it meant suffering on a massive scale. To save money, Ceaușescu cut almost all imports, including basic goods like grain, meat, fuel, and medicine. Romanian factories were forced to export nearly everything they produced, even while local shelves sat empty. He introduced strict rationing. Starting in 1981, each person was allowed only 500 grams of sugar per month, 1 liter of oil, and just a few eggs. Meat became so rare that it was sold in secret. Electricity was shut off for several hours a day. Gasoline was tightly controlled. Drivers could only get a few liters a week. Even water was sometimes cut off in apartments to conserve energy. By 1985, winter heating had become a major crisis. Apartment blocks in cities like Bucharest, Iași, and Cluj had little or no heat, even in freezing weather. Windows froze from the inside. People wore jackets indoors and cooked with candles or makeshift burners. Infant mortality rate rose sharply. In 1988, Romania had one of the highest infant death rates in Europe, roughly 23 per 1,000 live births. Hospitals lacked even basic medicine like aspirin or antibiotics. Doctors often reused syringes or performed surgeries without anesthesia. Malnourishment spread in schools. Children fainted from hunger during class. The Securitate controlled food inspections and blocked reports from reaching the outside world. Meanwhile, Ceaușescu traveled in bulletproof limousines and gave speeches about how happy and healthy his people were. One of his most extreme projects was the construction of the Palace of the People in Bucharest, started in 1984. It became the second largest administrative building in the world after the Pentagon. It had over 1,000 rooms, gold-plated ceilings, and marble halls. To make room for it, Ceaușescu demolished entire neighborhoods, including monasteries, schools, and over 7 square kilometers of residential homes. More than 40,000 people were relocated by force. They were given tiny apartments with no heat and very little privacy. Despite all this, Romanian state television only aired 2 hours a day, mostly filled with praise for Ceaușescu and Elena. The press published fake news, showing full markets and smiling workers. But people saw the truth every day in empty stores, long lines, and silent dinner tables. Anger grew behind closed doors. Families whispered about leaving the country or fighting back, but they knew the risks were deadly. But this silent suffering would finally explode. By December 1989, the rest of Eastern Europe was changing fast. On November 9th, the Berlin Wall came down in Germany. In Czechoslovakia, peaceful protests forced out the communist regime. In Poland, Solidarity had already formed a new government. Even Moscow, under Mikhail Gorbachev, was changing. But Ceaușescu refused to budge. He believed Romania was safe from rebellion. Then came Timișoara. Located near the Yugoslav and Hungarian borders, Timișoara was more open to outside information than other cities. On December 15, 1989, the Romanian government tried to evict a local pastor named Laszlo Tokes. He was a Hungarian-speaking clergyman who had spoken out against human rights violations and state oppression. The secret police saw him as a threat. When news spread that he was being removed, hundreds of his church members formed a human chain outside his home. That night, something shifted. More people joined, not just to defend Tokes, but to protest the regime itself. By the next day, thousands had gathered. They shouted, "Down with Ceaușescu," and sang banned songs. For the first time in decades, the fear barrier broke. Police and army units tried to break up the crowd. Tear gas was used, then live bullets. On December 17th, the army opened fire on protesters. Officially, the government admitted to around 73 deaths, but witnesses claimed the number was much higher. Some bodies were taken from morgues and cremated to erase the evidence. Hospitals in Timișoara were overwhelmed. Wounded protesters were denied treatment unless they stayed silent. Entire families searched for missing sons, daughters, and parents, unsure if they had been arrested or killed. But instead of scaring people, the violence spread outrage. Word of the massacre leaked through foreign radio broadcasts, especially Radio Free Europe. Crowds in other cities began to mobilize. The revolution had begun. And soon, Ceaușescu would come face to face with the reality he had denied for years, not from a foreign army, but from his own people. On the morning of December 21st, 1989, Ceaușescu still believed he had total control. The day before, he had returned from a short visit to Iran, unaware that his country was already starting to fall apart. As he stepped out onto the balcony of the Central Committee building in Bucharest, everything was set according to plan. Tens of thousands had been forced by party officials and Securitate agents to gather in University Square. The crowd had been bussed in, handed flags and banners, and told to clap on cue. State television was broadcasting live. The cameras were fixed on Ceaușescu. Behind him stood Elena and several top officials, all carefully arranged. His voice echoed over the square as he repeated the usual propaganda, blaming foreign agitators for unrest in the West, calling for unity, praising the victories of socialism. But then something strange happened. From somewhere deep in the crowd, a murmur began. Then it grew. Someone booed. Then another, and another. Soon the square was roaring with noise, angry noise. People were jeering, shouting, and even chanting anti-Ceaușescu slogans. Ceaușescu paused mid-sentence, his face twisted, not with fear at first, but confusion. He held out his hand in his usual gesture to silence them. It didn't work. The noise only got louder. For the first time in 25 years, the public had broken the script. For decades, the people had clapped when told, smiled when filmed, and cheered on command. Now in front of the entire country, they refused. Panic hit the stage. Aides moved in. The live feed was cut. Cameras turned away. Inside the Central Committee building, officials scrambled. Some tried to convince Ceaușescu it was just a provocation, but he knew something bigger had shifted. That same night, angry crowds began gathering again, this time without being told. Protests spilled into the surrounding streets. Clashes broke out between demonstrators and police. Tear gas filled the air. People fought back with stones and their bare hands. By the morning of December 22nd, it was chaos in Bucharest. Protesters stormed the Central Committee building. The military was split. Some soldiers were still taking orders from the regime, but many were starting to protect the crowds. Firefights broke out in the streets. Armored vehicles rolled through intersections, unsure whether to attack or defend. Ceaușescu watched from the top floor as the crowds broke through the gates. At 11:30 a.m., realizing they could no longer hold the building, Ceaușescu and Elena were rushed to the rooftop. A white Puma helicopter, piloted by Colonel Vasile Malutan, waited for them. They lifted off just as the masses began flooding the main hall. Ceaușescu thought he had escaped, but the skies didn't offer safety for long. As they flew westward, air traffic control began sending urgent messages. The military command had changed. Ceaușescu was now considered an enemy. The helicopter was ordered to land. The pilot made a decision. He pretended the fuel was low and brought the helicopter down near Târgoviște, about 80 kilometers northwest of Bucharest. From there, the dictator and his wife were on foot. They were driven by a series of increasingly nervous locals and minor officials. At one point, they tried hiding in a countryside schoolyard. They knocked on doors asking for help. Some slammed their doors shut. Others gave them bread, pretending not to recognize them. But word spread fast. People were no longer afraid. Instead, many were furious. By afternoon, a group of local policemen now aligned with the new Revolutionary Council spotted them. They were taken into custody without resistance. Ceaușescu tried to insist he was still the rightful president. The officers didn't respond. The couple was brought to a military garrison in Târgoviște, a cold, gray complex that had once been just another army base. Now it was where history would shift. There was no trial scheduled yet. No judge had been chosen. No defense lawyer had been contacted. They were simply locked in a plain room with 2 army beds, a toilet, and a few blankets. 3 soldiers were assigned to watch them at all times. Ceaușescu acted like nothing had changed. He demanded access to a telephone, he asked for his staff, he called himself President of the Socialist Republic of Romania, and refused to answer questions. Elena was even more combative. She insulted the guards, calling them traitors and fools. At one point, she tried to scratch one who brought her food. They refused to eat the meals they were given, claiming the food was poisoned. They didn't change clothes. They didn't bathe. Ceaușescu's shoes were torn. Elena's hair was uncombed. They looked nothing like the polished, all-powerful rulers Romanians had seen on TV. Outside the base, things were uncertain. The revolution wasn't fully settled. Fighting continued in Bucharest and a few other cities. Over 1,100 people had already died, most in the days after Ceaușescu fled the capital. The new leadership, led by Ion Iliescu, feared a possible counterattack by Ceaușescu loyalists. There were rumors that elite army divisions or Securitate units might try to rescue the couple. And worse, people feared a civil war. Iliescu and his advisors made a choice: a fast trial, no delays, no appeal. The people, they believed, needed closure. On the morning of December 25, 1989, inside the military base in Târgoviște, a makeshift courtroom was arranged in a small, bare room, barely large enough to hold the people involved. 4 military judges sat behind a table. 2 defense lawyers stood nearby, but they didn't speak much. Everyone knew this wasn't a normal trial. It was being filmed for proof that the dictator and his wife were finally being held accountable, no matter how rushed or messy it looked. Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu were marched in under heavy guard. They looked confused and angry, wearing the same clothes they'd had on for days. The charges were read out quickly. They were accused of causing the deaths of over 60,000 people during the recent uprising, though that number was never officially confirmed. They were also accused of wrecking the economy, stealing billions of dollars, and trying to flee the country instead of facing their people. Most of the accusations didn't come with solid evidence. There were no detailed documents and no real witnesses called in. But no one in the room doubted what they had done. The country was in chaos. People were dead in the streets. And the blame pointed squarely at them. Nicolae was furious. He kept shouting that the trial was illegal. He said only the Grand National Assembly could judge a president. He quoted the Romanian Constitution, waving his hands and ignoring the judges. He refused to recognize the court's authority and claimed the revolution was fake, pushed by foreign powers. Elena didn't stay silent either. She refused to sit, screamed at the guards, and even ordered one of them to kneel before her, still believing she had power. But no one listened. Not anymore. The entire proceeding lasted just 55 minutes. The decision was clear from the start. At the end of the trial, they delivered the sentence without hesitation: guilty on all counts. The punishment was death by firing squad. Immediate execution. There were no final statements from Nicolae or Elena. No chance for a goodbye or a last request. As soon as the sentence was given, soldiers took the Ceaușescus outside. It was still Christmas Day, but there was nothing peaceful about it. The couple was rushed through the yard. Ropes were taken from a nearby supply area. The soldiers tied Nicolae and Elena together, back to back. They weren't given blindfolds. Elena screamed again, demanding that they not be separated. She kept shouting that they wanted to die together. Nicolae tried to raise his voice over hers, yelling patriotic slogans, convinced that history would remember him as a hero. But his words felt hollow in the empty yard. No crowds were listening. No loyal guards stood at attention. 9 soldiers lined up in front of them. Not all of them wanted to pull the trigger, but they had no choice. One officer stepped forward and gave the command to fire. At exactly 2:50 p.m., gunshots tore through the cold air. Dozens of bullets hit Nicolae and Elena in seconds. Nicolae's body folded first, dropping to the ground with his knees giving out. Elena fell moments later, still screaming as she was shot. Their bodies lay in the snow for a few minutes. No prayers, no ceremony. Just lifeless figures wrapped in old winter coats, surrounded by rifle smoke and history's cold judgment. Soldiers wrapped the bodies in blankets. A helicopter waited nearby, ready to carry the videotape and the bodies back to Bucharest. The footage would later be shown on television to prove that the dictatorship was over. The man who demanded statues in every town and giant paintings in every school now had nothing. No funeral, no tomb, no legacy. Just a few seconds of grainy video showing the end of one of Europe's most feared leaders. But Romania's wounds wouldn't heal overnight. That evening, on Romanian state television, TVR, the news anchor appeared, visibly shaken. For years, every news hour had begun with Ceaușescu's voice or image. Now it opened with a single sentence: "The dictator is dead." Then they played the tape. Millions of Romanians sat in silence, in homes with no heat and cracked windows. Families huddled around black and white TVs to watch their past die in front of them. Some wept, not for Ceaușescu, but for everything they had lost during his rule. Others cheered or prayed. Some just stared blankly, unable to believe it.